Joining me now is the executive director of Iranian Americans for Liberty, Brian Leib. Brian, thanks so much for being with us tonight.
Jen, thanks for having me. Pleasure to be here.
Well, you know, the Biden administration has been adamant about getting Iran to rejoin Obama's 2015 nuclear deal. They have been in negotiations since May, but those talks came to a halt after Raisi's election in June. White House Press Secretary Jen Psaki was asked about all of that today. Let's take a listen.
It is in our interest to continue to pursue a diplomatic path forward. Because even though we certainly don't approve, in fact, we have great concern about a number of Iran's problematic activities in the global community, having visibility into their nuclear capabilities and capacities is in our national interest. The timeline is not endless.
Problematic activities, the old axis of evil is back and much worse than before, and the Biden administration is refusing to acknowledge it.
Yeah, and Jen just mentioned how it's in the best interest of this country for diplomacy with Iran. I beg to differ. I think diplomacy with the world's leading state sponsor of terrorism is not going to benefit the American people in any way, shape, or form. And let's talk for a second, Jen, about the inauguration of Abraham the Butcher Raisi today. It should be noted that in the front row, there were representatives, senior officials from Hamas, Hezbollah, Palestinian Jihad, and other terrorist organizations that the Iranian regime has been funding for decades. And who was right behind these terrorist organizations? The Deputy Secretary General, Enrique Moira, of the European Union. So that needs to be talked about. There's a lot of people that are making noise about that, but shame on the European Union for sending a representative to normalize this selection of the butcher.
And Brian, today 3 congressmen sent a letter to Joe Biden demanding answers after a report that the Iranian negotiators told Parliament that the Biden administration had agreed to lift sanctions against Raisi and members of Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei's inner circle, writing, quote, "Unfortunately, but unsurprisingly, it seems that the Parliament of Iran was briefed on the potential for such sanctions relief, while the Congress of the United States has been left in the dark as to the state of talks. They've asked for a response by next Friday. Doesn't lifting sanctions against known human rights abusers spread the message that the U.S. is willing to turn a blind eye to other abuses from other regimes?"
It certainly does send that message, and it should be noted that the new president of Iran is already on the U.S. sanctions list for his vast human rights abuses. So that's who we're dealing with right now. Listen, the Iranian regime, they haven't changed their tune all too much since 1979. It's death to America. It's death to Israel. It's funding terrorism all around the world while oppressing, censoring, and murdering their own civilians for speaking out against the atrocities that are happening. As we speak, there are Iranians that are taking to the streets right now to protest this dictator and this regime for little things like you and I and Americans and your listeners or viewers take for granted, going to the faucet and getting a drink of water, or turning on the light switch and having electricity. These are basic human rights that the people of Iran should have that right now they don't have, and they are protesting all throughout the country. President Biden needs to get tough on the Iranian regime, and more importantly, he needs to break his silence, Jen. He hasn't said a word. You've had Ned Price, the spokesperson of the State Department. He has spoken out. You have Secretary Blinken, with some wishy-washy statements. At the end of the day, the guy living behind me right here, the leader of the free world, would be well advised to start speaking out against what's happening and to voice his support for the Iranian regime. The bottom line, in my opinion, diplomacy with the Iranian regime has failed. It was going to fail from day one, and we've got to get tough on this regime. That's the only language they understand, Jen.
Well, further, Brian, Iran is spinning more advanced centrifuges than ever before. They're generating uranium at near weapons-grade level for the first time. And Israel's prime minister claims Iran is just 10 weeks away from being able to develop a nuclear weapon. Now, because of that, Israel is ready. They're willing to attack. And the White House is talking about, quote, diplomacy being the answer. Iran responded today warning, don't test us. Is the time for diplomacy over?
The time for diplomacy has been over for a while, and listen, when the Israelis start telling us what's happening inside of Iran, the world should be listening. No one knows better what's happening inside of Iran than the Israelis. You know, we've got to do everything that we can to support the Israelis. If they do decide to take action, that's in their country's best interest. And we are a partner. We have an alliance with the state of Israel, and we need to stand with our partners, and especially against this regime. And let's also put our cards on the table. Over the last couple weeks, the Iranian regime, through their proxies and through the IRGC, they've been attacking commercial shipping vessels in international waters. It was just this past Friday when they attacked a ship called the Mercer Street. And unfortunately, this time, people died. The last couple attacks, no one had died. This time, 2 people died, a Romanian and someone from the United Kingdom. President Biden hasn't said a word. When is he going to get tough with this regime? That's the only language they understand. You know, President Trump had it right. It's peace through strength. It's not the other way around. And I just wish President Biden would take a page out of President Trump's book as it relates to Iran and obviously to a lot of other things as well, but specifically as it relates to Iran. You got to get tough with these people. That's all they understand.
Indeed. Well, Brian Leib, thank you so much for joining us. We appreciate it.
My pleasure. Thank you, Jen.